The final 12 seconds. May the 22nd, 2026. 7:28 in the evening, Texas time. The sky over the Gulf of Mexico has already gone the color of a bruise, deep violet bleeding into black. And on a launch pad at the southern edge of the United States, the largest machine ever built by human hands stands 400 feet tall, venting white plumes of frozen oxygen into air superheated by ambition. 33 Raptor engines. Engines that burn methane and oxygen at a temperature hot enough to melt steel, contained by nothing but physics and a margin of error measured in millimeters. Engines designed to do what no engine in the history of spaceflight has ever done. Fly, fall, and fly again. This is Starship. This is Flight 12. And for 2 minutes and 20 seconds, it is flawless. Ignition. Liftoff. 17 million pounds of thrust tearing the vehicle off the pad, faster than sound, faster than thought. A column of fire visible from space before the rocket itself has even left the atmosphere. The booster, super heavy, does exactly what it was built to do. It carries its passenger, the upper stage, the ship, higher, faster, further than any reusable rocket in human history. Then comes the separation. Hot staging. The upper stage ignites its own engines while still attached to the booster beneath it. A maneuver so violent, so precisely timed, that a single millisecond of error would tear both vehicles apart. It does not fail. The ship pulls away, clean, controlled, climbing toward the edge of the world. The booster begins its return, and this is where the story should end. A triumph, a headline, another step toward Mars. But 12 seconds change everything. 12 seconds is nothing. 12 seconds is the time it takes to read this sentence aloud. 12 seconds is shorter than a commercial break, shorter than a held breath, shorter than the gap between a flash of lightning and the thunder that follows it. And in those 12 seconds, the booster does not slow down. It does not stabilize. It begins to rotate. Abnormally, violently, a 40-meter steel cylinder the height of a 30-story building starting to tumble in the upper atmosphere at speeds that should be physically impossible to survive. One engine shuts down, then another, then another. The numbers on the telemetry feed do not lie. 32 engines, then 5. The boost-back burn, the precise, choreographed firing that was supposed to guide this machine gently back toward the water, collapses into chaos. 900 miles per hour. That is the speed at which 2,000 tons of stainless steel, engineered to return home with the grace of a falling feather, instead strikes the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. Not a landing, an impact. The kinetic energy released in that instant is measured not in the language of rocketry, but in the language of small earthquakes. A sudden, total conversion of velocity into heat, into pressure, into a flash of white water and vapor visible on camera feeds from orbit. Everything was perfect. The ignition, the thrust, the separation, the climb into the silence above the sky, until the final 12 seconds. Because out there, past the thin blue line of breathable air, past the place where sound stops traveling and the stars stop twinkling and simply burn, the universe does not forgive small errors. It does not negotiate. It does not offer second chances measured in anything longer than the time it takes a flame to gutter out. This is the story of what happens when humanity's most ambitious machine meets the absolute, indifferent mathematics of the cosmos. Not a story of failure, a story of the threshold. the razor's edge between triumph and catastrophe that every act of leaving this planet has always balanced upon, since the very first rocket ever rose into the dark. 12 seconds. That is all it takes to remind an entire species how small it still is. The booster did not explode. This is important to understand, because explosion implies sabotage, implies a bomb, implies intent. What happened in those 12 seconds was something far more unsettling, because it was not malice. It was mathematics. It was the universe simply doing what the universe always does when the margins of a system are pushed past their tolerance. It found the weakness, and it followed it, instantly, without mercy, without warning. To understand those 12 seconds, you have to understand what a rocket booster actually is in the moment after separation. It is not a vehicle anymore. Not really. It is an enormous, hollow tube of stainless steel, nearly empty of fuel, tumbling through air at the edge of space. And at that moment, it becomes one of the most unstable objects that has ever existed in the sky. Picture a figure skater pulling her arms inward mid-spin. As her mass moves closer to her center, her rotation accelerates, not because she is pushing harder, but because angular momentum has nowhere else to go. It must be conserved. It must express itself somewhere. Now imagine that skater is 2,000 tons of steel, and the spin she begins cannot be stopped by simply extending her arms again. There is no graceful recovery. There is only the spin, and what the spin does to everything around it. This is what happened to Super Heavy. As propellant burned away and the booster's mass redistributed, its center of gravity shifted. Subtly, but enough. Combine that shift with the asymmetric thrust of engines shutting down unevenly across a ring of 33 nozzles, and you create something engineers have a clinical, almost gentle term for: uncommanded torque. A twisting force the vehicle's own brain, its flight computer, firing hundreds of corrective commands per second through engine gimbals no wider than dinner plates, was never designed to fully counteract. The engines didn't fail randomly. They failed in a cascade, each loss making the next loss more likely, the way a single damp brick in a foundation doesn't just weaken a wall. It changes the load on every brick beside it, until the whole structure is failing by a logic no single brick could have predicted on its own. There is a name for this kind of failure in engineering philosophy. It is called a normal accident, a term coined not to describe carelessness, but inevitability. The idea, first formalized by the sociologist Charles Perrow after studying nuclear power plants, is unsettling in its honesty. In any system complex enough, interconnected enough, operating close enough to its limits, catastrophic failure is not a possibility to be eliminated. It is a mathematical certainty waiting for its moment. Starship, with its 33 engines, its millions of components, its propellant chilled to nearly absolute zero and burned at temperatures that rival the surface of stars, is perhaps one of the most complex machines human beings have ever asked to fly. And complexity, however brilliantly engineered, is never free. It is purchased with risk. Every redundancy added to prevent one failure opens a new, smaller door through which an unforeseen failure can walk in. Now consider the steel itself. Stainless steel, not carbon fiber, not the exotic aerospace alloys you might expect from a vehicle meant to touch the void. SpaceX chose steel deliberately, almost defiantly, because of a property most people never think about: cryogenic ductility. At the temperatures near -160 degrees Celsius, where the liquid oxygen and liquid methane inside that booster are stored, most metals become brittle, prone to fracturing like glass left in a freezer. Stainless steel does the opposite. It grows stronger in the cold. It was chosen because the very environment that would shatter lesser materials makes this one more resilient. A strange and beautiful inversion, where the harshness of the void becomes the source of strength rather than the cause of failure. And yet strength against cold could not save it from torque. This is the deeper truth hidden inside those 12 seconds. A material can be perfectly engineered for one kind of violence and still be utterly unprepared for another. The booster's steel skin could have survived the deep cold of space. It could not survive spinning sideways through the thickening atmosphere at hundreds of miles per hour. Subjected to aerodynamic forces, it was never built to absorb from that angle. Every structure, no matter how strong, has a shape to its strength. Push it the way it was designed to be pushed, and it becomes nearly indestructible. Push it from an unexpected direction, and that same strength becomes irrelevant. There is something almost unbearably human in that. We build our lives, our institutions, our bodies, to withstand the dangers we can predict. We armor ourselves against the storms we have seen before. And then the failure comes from the angle nobody braced for. The asymmetric torque, the uncommanded spin, the 12 seconds nobody rehearsed. Think now about the impact itself, because the physics of that final moment deserve to be understood, not glossed over. A falling object's destructive power does not increase in a straight line with its speed. It increases with the square of it. Double the velocity, and you do not double the violence of the impact. You quadruple it. The booster struck the Gulf of Mexico not at some modest descent rate, but at roughly 900 miles per hour. And at that speed, water itself stops behaving like a forgiving liquid. It behaves, for the fraction of a second that matters, almost like concrete. This is the same principle that allows a diver to shatter bones, belly flopping from a height that would be perfectly survivable as a clean dive. Surface tension and resistance, at sufficient velocity, transform a soft thing into a hard one. 2,000 tons of steel met an unyielding wall made of nothing but ocean and physics. And in that instant, kinetic energy equivalent to several tons of high explosive converted itself into heat, sound, and a column of vaporized seawater visible from satellites in orbit. And here is where the philosophy deepens. Because this single event, 12 seconds, one failed booster, one dramatic flash of white water against a darkening sky, is not really a story about one rocket. It is a story about the price of standing at the edge of what is known. Every civilization that has ever pushed itself toward the unknown has paid in failures like this one. The earliest mariners who sailed beyond the sight of land did not have the luxury of perfect knowledge before they left the harbor. They learned the shape of the ocean's fury, one wrecked ship at a time. The engineers of the first steam locomotives did not understand metal fatigue until boilers had already exploded beneath them. Space flight has never been an exception to this pattern. It has only made the lesson more expensive, more public, more spectacular to watch unfold. Within hours, the Federal Aviation Administration would formally classify this booster's destruction as a mishap, a clinical word for an event that, on any other night, in any other field, might simply be called a tragedy narrowly avoided. No one was harmed. The Gulf swallowed the wreckage and returned, by morning, to its ordinary stillness. But somewhere in that data, in the telemetry streams, the engine-out timestamps, the angular velocity curves climbing toward instability, is a record of exactly how close the edge of knowledge sits to the edge of disaster. 12 seconds was the distance between a controlled splashdown and an uncontrolled one. 12 seconds was the margin between intention and entropy. And entropy, in the end, is the quiet character running through this entire story. The second law of thermodynamics, indifferent and absolute. The simple, inescapable truth that every ordered system in this universe is constantly, ceaselessly being pulled apart by the very forces that allow it to exist in the first place. A rocket is, in essence, a temporary argument against entropy, an extraordinarily organized exception to the universe's preference for disorder, held together for a few violent minutes by precision, computation, and the controlled application of explosive chemistry. For 2 minutes and 20 seconds, that argument held. And then, for 12 seconds, it didn't. This is not a story about a machine that failed. It is a story about the price every species must pay to leave the gravity well it was born inside of, measured not only in dollars, not only in steel, but in moments exactly like this one, where the boundary between flight and falling reveals itself to be far thinner than anyone standing on solid ground ever truly wants to believe. The ship told a different story, while the booster's wreckage was still settling into silence at the bottom of the Gulf. 65 miles above the Indian Ocean, the upper stage of Starship was falling through the sky at 25 times the speed of sound. And it was, by every measure that matters, succeeding. This contrast deserves to sit with you for a moment, because it is the philosophical heart of this entire story. Two halves of the same machine, born in the same factory, fueled by the same propellant, governed by the same flight computer architecture. And yet, one became a column of vaporized seawater, while the other became a controlled, deliberate, almost balletic descent through the most violent environment a human-made object can survive. The difference between those two outcomes was not luck. It was design philosophy. And to understand it, you have to understand what it actually means to fall from space on purpose. When the ship separated from its dying booster and continued its climb, it was entering what aerospace engineers call, with characteristic understatement, the entry interface, the invisible boundary, roughly 62 miles up, where the thin trace of atmosphere stops being a vacuum and starts being a wall. At orbital and near-orbital velocities, that wall does not feel soft. A spacecraft does not gently slow down as it re-enters. It slams into molecules of air at such extraordinary speed that the air itself has no time to get out of the way. It compresses. It superheats. It becomes plasma. The fourth state of matter, the same incandescent substance that makes up the surface of the sun, briefly conjured into existence in a thin sheath around a falling spacecraft by nothing more than friction and velocity. Picture striking a single match against a rough surface. The heat that ignites the match head is not the match burning slowly. It's the violent, instantaneous conversion of kinetic energy, the energy of motion, into thermal energy, the energy of heat, concentrated into a fraction of a second. Now scale that principle up by a factor of billions. The ship, weighing roughly 200 tons even when nearly empty, carried kinetic energy equivalent to a small thermonuclear event. And re-entry is, in the most literal physical sense, the controlled, deliberate bleeding off of that energy into the atmosphere, converting unimaginable speed into unimaginable heat on purpose, by design, so that what reaches the ocean below is a spacecraft and not a meteor. This is why the ship doesn't fall nose first, the way intuition might suggest a sleek vehicle should. It falls on its belly, flat, broad, presenting its widest surface to the oncoming wall of air, exactly the way a skydiver instinctively spreads their arms and legs to slow their fall by maximizing drag. There is something almost startlingly elegant in this. The most sophisticated spacecraft ever built, executing a maneuver any child belly flopping off a diving board intuitively understands. Surface area is salvation. The wider you make yourself, the more the atmosphere is forced to catch you, the slower you fall, the cooler you stay. Aerodynamics, at its core, does not care about your sophistication. It only cares about your shape. And on that broad, flat belly sit the tiles. Thousands of individual hexagonal ceramic plates, black as a starless sky, fitted together with the precision of a mosaic that has to survive being hammered by superheated plasma reaching temperatures upward of 1400 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to liquefy steel. Hot enough that the air itself glows, a phenomenon visible to anyone who has ever watched footage of a spacecraft re-entering at night, that eerie, beautiful corona of pink and orange light, wrapping around the vehicle like a halo made of fire. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most violent visual phenomena a human eye can witness and still call survivable. The genius of those tiles is not that they prevent heat. Nothing prevents heat at those temperatures. The genius is that they manage where the heat goes. Ceramic, unlike metal, is a poor conductor. It does not eagerly pass thermal energy from one molecule to the next, the way steel or aluminum does. This means the outer face of a tile can be glowing, incandescent, hot enough to liquefy solid air, while less than an inch beneath it, the aluminum structure of the spacecraft remains merely warm. It is a kind of engineered ignorance, a material so reluctant to share information about its own suffering that the rest of the vehicle never finds out how bad things got on the surface. There's something quietly profound in that, if you let yourself sit with it. Survival, in this context, is not the absence of catastrophe. It is the successful containment of catastrophe to a place where it cannot spread. Contrast that now with what happened to the booster. The booster's failure was a cascade. One engine's loss destabilizing the whole, one problem begetting the next, a system with no isolation between its parts, where damage in one location was free to propagate everywhere. The ship's heat shield is the opposite philosophy made physical. Thousands of individually replaceable tiles, each one isolated from its neighbors, each one capable of failing, cracking, chipping, even falling away entirely, without dooming the tiles beside it. Engineers call this graceful degradation. And the phrase itself deserves a moment of reflection, because it describes something rare and valuable, not just in spacecraft, but in any system, biological or mechanical, that hopes to survive contact with a hostile environment. A body that can lose a single cell without losing the organ. A society that can lose a single institution without losing its civilization. A flight that can lose one engine, as the ship did, 65 seconds into ascent. A vacuum-rated Raptor falling silent while its 5 remaining siblings simply worked harder to compensate, without losing the mission. Because that is what happened, and it deserves to be said plainly. The ship lost an engine too. The same category of failure that doomed the booster occurred on the upper stage as well. And the ship did not fall apart. It adjusted its trajectory, accepted a longer burn from its remaining engines, traded a small amount of precision for the preservation of the whole, and continued. This is engine-out capability. The design principle that no single point of failure should be permitted to end the mission. The same philosophical backbone that allows a commercial airliner to lose an engine mid-flight and still land safely. The same instinct that billions of years ago drove biological evolution to give complex organisms 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, 2 eyes, rather than one of each. Redundancy is not inefficiency. Redundancy is the universe's oldest insurance policy against entropy, written into the architecture of starships and bloodstreams alike. What is remarkable, what should genuinely unsettle and inspire you in equal measure, is that the same 12 seconds of chaos that destroyed the booster were, structurally, almost a mirror image of conditions the ship itself was simultaneously enduring. Both vehicles lost an engine early. Both vehicles experienced a deviation from their planned trajectory. The booster's deviation amplified into a fatal spin because its control authority, its ability to correct itself using gimbaled engines and aerodynamic flaps, was overwhelmed by the asymmetry of its failure. The ship's deviation did not amplify because its flight computer had margin to spare, control surfaces with enough authority to compensate, and a trajectory with enough slack built into it to absorb a problem without collapsing. The booster was a system living at the edge of its capability. The ship, that day, was a system with room to fail and still recover. This is the quiet lesson sitting beneath all the fire and plasma and ocean spray. Survival in any complex system, cosmic or terrestrial, mechanical or biological, is rarely about avoiding damage altogether. It is about how much damage a system can absorb before the damage itself becomes the new operating condition. Before falling apart becomes falling, full stop. The ship descended through temperatures that would vaporize most materials known to industrial chemistry, executed a banking maneuver designed to deliberately stress its own control flaps even further, intentionally testing the outer edges of its own survivability, and emerged from the plasma sheath intact, decelerating from 25 times the speed of sound to a gentle, vertical splashdown in waters the color of cut sapphire west of Australia. 2 outcomes. 1 mission. The same 12 seconds in spirit, lived twice, once as catastrophe, once as triumph. And the difference between them was never about which vehicle wanted to survive more. Want has nothing to do with it in physics. The difference was entirely, coldly, beautifully, a matter of how much room each system had been given in advance to fail just a little, without failing completely. While Super Heavy was still settling into the silence of the Gulf floor, something smaller, almost overlooked in the drama of that night, was quietly doing something no Starship mission had ever done before. 2 small satellites, deployed from the ship just before its own descent began, drifted away from the spacecraft and turned their cameras backward, watching, recording, studying the very heat shield that would soon decide whether the vehicle above them lived or died. SpaceX had nicknamed them, with the kind of dark humor engineers reserve for machines they respect. Dodger dogs. A joke, a release of tension, the same instinct that makes soldiers paint cartoons on the noses of bombers and surgeons crack jokes in operating rooms. Beneath the humor, though, sat something profoundly serious. These were the first eyes a starship had ever turned upon itself in flight. Not telemetry, not sensors buried beneath the tiles reporting temperature as a column of numbers. Actual images, actual light, reflected off thousands of hexagonal ceramic plates, captured in the seconds before atmospheric reentry would either validate or annihilate them. Consider what this means philosophically, because it is easy to let the engineering obscure the strangeness of the act itself. This was a machine pausing, mid-flight, between the chaos of ascent and the violence of return, to look at itself, to check its own armor before walking back into fire. There is something almost unbearably human in that gesture, if you allow yourself to see it that way. The instinct to examine your own wounds before deciding whether you can still stand, still run, still survive the next trial. Self-inspection is not a capability evolution granted casually. Most organisms in the history of life on Earth have never been able to see their own bodies from the outside. Humans needed mirrors, and then cameras, and then satellites to develop something even our own biology denied us by default. The ability to observe ourselves as an object in space, vulnerable, examined, understood from a vantage point we could never naturally occupy. Starship, on its 12th flight, briefly possessed that same capacity. It split a piece of its own awareness away from itself and used it to look back. Why does this matter so much that an entire test flight would be built partly around proving it works? Because of a number sitting quietly beneath every Starship mission. A number that defines the entire architecture of NASA's return to the moon. 10. SpaceX's current public timeline requires roughly 10 or more separate tanker launches, each one a full Starship flight in its own right, to refuel a single Starship in Earth orbit before it has enough propellant to travel onward to the moon. 10 launches, each one needing to succeed, each one needing its vehicle to survive re-entry intact enough to fly again within days, not months. This is not spaceflight in the old sense, a single, irreplaceable capsule, inspected for weeks on the ground by hand, flown once and retired to a museum. This is closer to commercial aviation, where the entire economic and logistical model depends on the same airframe flying again and again, inspected not over weeks, but in the gap between landing and the next morning's launch window. And you cannot inspect by hand what you cannot reach quickly. A heat shield that needs a human technician crawling beneath the vehicle with a flashlight, cataloging each of the thousands of individual tiles one at a time, does not support a launch cadence measured in days. It supports a launch cadence measured in months. And a moon mission requiring 10 consecutive successful refueling flights, at a pace of one every few months, is not a moon mission. It is a decade. The camera satellites deployed on Flight 12, watching the heat shield from orbit, recording its condition before the worst of the heat ever arrived, are the first thread of an entirely different model. Automated, data-driven, rapid. Scan the armor from a distance. Flag the damage before the vehicle even lands. Know what needs repair before the ship has even touched water. There is an old principle in seafaring that predates rocketry by centuries, and it applies here with an almost eerie precision. A ship that must be fully rebuilt after every voyage was never really built to sail the ocean. It was built to survive a single crossing, the age of true exploration, the age where humanity stopped visiting a destination and started living in relationship with it. Has always required vehicles capable of return, recovery, and reflight, not vehicles capable merely of arrival. The Polynesian voyaging canoes that crossed thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean over 1,000 years ago were not single-use vessels. They were built, provisioned, and sailed with the explicit understanding that the canoe itself would carry generations of further journeys, that the knowledge of how it performed on one crossing would directly inform how it was repaired and improved before the next. Starship's heat shield inspection satellites are, in a very real sense, the same idea, expressed through stainless steel and ceramic tile instead of lashed timber and woven sail. The conviction that a vehicle's history must inform its future, that survival is not a single test to pass once, but a relationship to be maintained continuously. This is where the stakes of that night stop being abstract and start becoming deeply, almost uncomfortably human. NASA has formally selected a version of Starship as the human landing system for Artemis 4. The mission currently targeted to return American astronauts to the lunar surface, tentatively in 2028, the first crewed moon landing attempt in more than half a century. Every refueling flight this architecture requires, every heat shield inspection it depends on, every engine-out failure it must learn to absorb without catastrophe, is not occurring in some sealed laboratory of abstract engineering. It is occurring in direct, unbroken sequence toward a future where human beings, not satellites, not cargo, not Starlink simulators painted to look like ballpark hot dogs, will be standing inside one of these vehicles when it experiences its own version of an uncommanded spin, its own 12 seconds of chaos at the edge of control. This is the weight that should sit on you as you consider that night over the Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Every failure tested now in a vehicle carrying no human life is failure being spent in advance, purchased deliberately, on purpose, in the cheapest currency available, so that it does not have to be purchased later in the only currency that can never be refunded. This is not a new philosophy in the history of exploration. It is, in fact, the oldest one humanity has ever practiced, though it has rarely been stated this plainly. Every bridge tested to its breaking point before a traffic crosses it. Every vaccine trialed first in cell cultures, then in animals, long before it reaches a human arm. Every aircraft pushed through wind tunnels and stress tests designed explicitly to make it fail in a controlled setting, so that it will not choose, unpredictably, to fail in flight. Spaceflight inherited this same grim arithmetic from its very first moments, written into the program in the blood of those who came before. The 3 astronauts lost in a launch pad fire during a routine test in January of 1967. The 7 lost when a rubber seal failed in cold weather in January of 1986. The 7 lost when damaged heat shield tiles, ironically, allowed superheated plasma to breach a wing during re-entry in February of 2003. Each of those losses rewrote, permanently and irreversibly, the engineering standards of everything that followed. Each one became a kind of terrible inheritance, a debt paid in full so that future missions would not have to pay it again in the same way. Flight 12's booster, crashing into the Gulf at 900 miles per hour, falls into a gentler category than those histories. No human aboard it, no life extinguished. A mishap rather than a tragedy in the FAA's clinical language. But it belongs to the same lineage, the same grim arithmetic. It is failure, spent now deliberately, on an empty vehicle, specifically so that it need not be spent later on a vehicle carrying a human being's irreplaceable single life. There is something almost sacrificial in the architecture of modern test flight programs, if you allow the word its full philosophical weight. Not sacrifice in the sense of waste, but sacrifice in its oldest sense. The deliberate offering of something of value in exchange for the safety of what comes after. Every engine that fails in an empty booster over the Gulf of Mexico is, in the coldest and most literal sense, an offering made on behalf of astronauts who have not yet been chosen, whose names are not yet known, who will one day stand on a launch pad trusting that 12 seconds like these have already happened, already been studied, already been engineered into impossibility before their own boots ever leave the ground. Step back now, far enough that the Gulf of Mexico becomes a thin blue thread on the horizon, far enough that the entire continent becomes a curve of brown and green wrapped around a turning planet, and a different kind of context begins to emerge. One that has less to do with engines and tiles and more to do with why any of this is happening at all. 3 days before that booster struck the water, SpaceX filed paperwork with American financial regulators, formally beginning the process toward what analysts describe as one of the largest public stock offerings in the history of the aerospace industry. This detail might seem at first glance to belong to a different documentary entirely. A story about markets, not rockets. But sit with it for a moment, Because the connection is not incidental. It is the entire engine driving the speed at which this story unfolds. For most of the history of spaceflight, failure was a private grief absorbed by government agencies answerable to taxpayers and congressional oversight committees, occurring on timescales measured in years between attempts. A single national space agency could afford to pause for 18 months after a tragedy, conduct an exhaustive internal investigation, rebuild trust slowly, deliberately, away from the immediate pressure of a balance sheet. The model unfolding at Starbase operates under an entirely different physics. Not the physics of orbital mechanics, but the physics of capital, where billions of dollars in committed satellite contracts, a backlog reported to be worth $7 billion and growing, sit waiting on a launch cadence that simply cannot tolerate the old, patient rhythm of 20th century spaceflight. The Federal Aviation Administration's response to Flight 12, grounding the entire Starship program, mandating a formal mishap investigation before Flight 13 can fly, is not bureaucratic caution for its own sake. It is the last remaining brake pedal in a system otherwise moving at the speed of quarterly earnings, expectations, and investor confidence. There is a strange and important truth buried here. The very mechanism intended to slow this program down in the name of safety is now operating in direct tension with the financial mechanism accelerating it forward. Two forces pulling against each other, and the actual safety of future astronauts depends entirely on which one wins more often. This is not unique to rockets. It is, in fact, one of the oldest tensions in the entire history of human risk-taking. The tension between the speed at which ambition wants to move and the speed at which wisdom is actually capable of accumulating. The same tension sat inside every gold rush that sent prospectors into collapsing mine shafts faster than safety codes could be written. The same tension sat inside the early decades of commercial aviation, when airlines raced each other across oceans in machines whose failure rates would be considered unthinkable by today's standards. Because the economic prize for arriving first outweighed, in the minds of those funding the flights, the mounting body count of those who did not arrive at all. Spaceflight is not exempt from this pattern. It has simply dressed the same ancient impatience in newer, more elegant clothing. Carbon composite and cryogenic steel instead of canvas sails and biplane wings. And yet, and this deserves to be said with complete honesty, without cynicism dressed up as wisdom, this same impatience, this same uncomfortable marriage between ambition and capital, has also been the only force in human history powerful enough to actually put a species on a trajectory toward leaving its home planet permanently. Government space programs, however noble, however careful, have never by themselves generated the economic gravity required to make multiplanetary life anything more than a slogan printed on a conference room slide. It took something closer to madness. Financial, technical, philosophical madness. To build a rocket factory that treats each starship not as a singular monument, like the Saturn V that once carried humans to the moon, but as a mass-produced object, intended to be built by the dozens, flown by the hundreds, lost occasionally and without ceremony. The way a shipping company loses the occasional container overboard without halting global trade. This is industrial logic, applied to a problem the species had previously only ever approached with the reverence of a cathedral being built one stone at a time across 100 years. Now widen the frame even further, past the markets, past the regulators, past the engineers standing in mission control with their headsets and their telemetry screens. Out to the actual destination all of this machinery is, however indirectly, ultimately pointed toward Mars, a planet on average, roughly 140 million miles from Earth, though the true distance shifts dramatically depending on where each world sits in its orbit around the sun. A radio signal, traveling at the absolute speed limit of the universe, 186,000 miles every single second, still takes between 4 and 24 minutes. One direction to cross that gap. This means a human being standing on the Martian surface, watching something go wrong, cannot call home and ask for help in real time. There is no real time, not anymore, not out there. There is only a question sent into the dark, and an answer that arrives long after the moment it could have mattered most. This is perhaps the truest, coldest fact buried beneath every detail explored so far. On Earth, in low orbit, 65 miles above the Indian Ocean, a starship in trouble has options measured in minutes. Abort sequences, ground controllers a quarter second of radio delay away, rescue architecture decades in the making. On the surface of Mars, none of that exists. A crew facing their own version of an uncommanded spin, their own 12 seconds of cascading failure, would face it utterly alone. Separated from every authority, every expert, every resource that has ever existed to support human beings through crisis. By a gulf of empty space that light itself takes the better part of half an hour to cross. The entirety of human civilization's accumulated wisdom about how to survive catastrophe becomes, at that distance, almost entirely theoretical. Encoded in advance, in training, in redundant systems engineered months earlier by people who are no longer present, who cannot be consulted, who can only hope they thought of everything that mattered. This is the deeper, quieter reason why a single booster crashing into the Gulf of Mexico, with no human aboard, with no life lost, with consequences contained entirely to insurance paperwork and a regulatory grounding, matters as much as it does. It is not really a story about one test flight. It is a rehearsal. Possibly the most important kind of rehearsal a species has ever conducted. For a future in which failure will not arrive with the comforting nearness of a launch tower 40 miles away and a recovery team already in the water. It will arrive on a world where the nearest human help is, at minimum, tens of millions of miles distant, where the very air is unbreathable, where the temperature swings from a relatively mild daytime warmth to a night cold enough to freeze carbon dioxide directly out of the thin atmosphere, where radiation unfiltered by any meaningful magnetic field or atmospheric shielding falls constantly onto a surface no human body evolved to withstand. For more than brief, carefully managed exposures, every Raptor engine that fails now, harmlessly, over the warm and forgiving waters of the Gulf of Mexico, is a single failure mode crossed permanently off the list of failures a future Mars crew will ever have to discover. For the first time, alone, with no one listening close enough to help. Every tile that survives re-entry intact, every tile that does not, every camera satellite watching the ship's belly for damage before it lands, is a small fragment of knowledge being deposited, almost like sediment settling at the bottom of a riverbed, into the foundation of something that does not yet exist, but is, undeniably, slowly, being built, layer by layer, failure by failure, 12 seconds at a time. There is a strange comfort hidden inside this otherwise unforgiving arithmetic, if you are willing to look for it. The universe does not owe this species safe passage outward. It has never once, in the 4.5 billion years this planet has existed, offered an easy path to anything alive upon it. But it is, in its own indifferent, mathematical way, consistent, and consistency, to an engineer, to a species capable of learning, is not cruelty. It is simply the rule book, written once, applied evenly, available to be studied by anyone patient enough, humble enough, and willing enough to fail in the safest place available before being asked to succeed in the most dangerous one that has ever existed. Consider for a moment the precise geometry of where you are sitting right now as you listen to this. You are standing, or sitting, or lying still, on the surface of a rock orbiting a star, in a galaxy containing somewhere between 100 and 400 billion other stars, inside an observable universe containing, by current estimate, roughly 2 trillion other galaxies. The light reaching your eyes from the most distant of those galaxies left its source before the Earth itself had finished cooling from a molten ball of rock into something solid enough to walk upon. Against that backdrop, against that almost incomprehensible scale, 12 seconds of a booster losing control above the Gulf of Mexico seems, by any reasonable cosmic accounting, to be nothing at all. A rounding error? A flicker gone before it could ever register as significant against the age and breadth of everything that exists. And yet, those 12 seconds are also, in a very real sense, everything, because the universe, for all its staggering scale, has shown no evidence, not one confirmed signal, not one verified trace across every survey, every search, every instrument humanity has ever pointed toward the dark, of anywhere else where this particular kind of event is even possible. Nowhere else, as far as the most careful observations of modern science can currently determine, is there a species capable of building an engine, igniting it, and asking it to carry flesh and blood away from the gravity well that flesh and blood evolved inside of. The silence answering every search for other voices in the cosmos, the unbroken quiet of every radio telescope listening across every frequency band humanity knows how to listen on, may simply mean that distance and time make contact statistically improbable. Or it may mean something colder, something the booster crashing into the Gulf forces you to confront directly. That the journey from a single, fragile biosphere to a genuinely multiplanetary, redundant, surviving civilization is far harder than ambition alone can carry a species across. That somewhere between simple chemistry organizing itself into life, and that life eventually building something capable of escaping its homeworld permanently, lies a filter so difficult, so unforgiving, that most attempts, if other attempts have ever existed at all, simply do not make it through. This is not despair. This is, properly understood, the single most important reason every detail explored across this story matters as much as it does. If the universe is, as the silence suggests, largely a place where intelligent life either does not commonly arise or commonly fails to survive its own adolescence, then every 12-second failure absorbed safely, every engine lost without a human life lost alongside it, every heat shield tile that holds against 1400 degrees of compressed, superheated air becomes something far larger than an engineering footnote. It becomes evidence, fragile, incomplete, but real, that this particular attempt, on this particular world, orbiting this particular star, might be one of the rare ones that actually makes it through the filter. Not because the universe favors this species. The universe, demonstrably, favors nothing. It simply applies its laws evenly, indifferently, to every arrangement of matter complex enough to ask it questions. But because this species, alone among everything currently known to exist, has chosen to spend its failures deliberately in controlled settings over empty water, specifically so they need not be spent later in the one place where there will be no one close enough to help. There is an old idea, older than spaceflight, older than written history, that keeps surfacing inside every part of this story, wearing different clothes each time. The idea that survival is never really the absence of danger, but the accumulated hard-won knowledge of exactly where danger lives, learned at the smallest possible cost and passed forward to those who come after. The earliest humans who learned which mushrooms could kill and which could nourish did not learn this from a textbook. They learned it from each other's deaths, absorbed slowly across uncounted generations, until the knowledge became instinct, became culture, became the invisible inheritance every child receives simply by being born into a species old enough to have already paid that price. Every civilization that has ever endured has, in its own way, been built on top of a foundation made of exactly this kind of accumulated, hard-bought wisdom. Failures absorbed by the few, so that knowledge could be inherited by the many. What happened above the Gulf of Mexico on the 22nd of May is, stripped of all its fire and steel and spectacle, simply the newest chapter in that same old, unbroken human practice. A booster spun out of control and struck the water at 900 miles per hour. Not because anyone wanted it to, but because somewhere in the architecture of 33 engines and a flight computer making hundreds of corrections per second, a margin proved too thin, a tolerance proved too narrow. An assumption proved imperfect against the actual, indifferent behavior of physics. And in the same 12 seconds, on the same night, 65 miles above a different ocean, a sister vehicle absorbed an almost identical failure. An engine lost, a trajectory disrupted, and did not fall apart. Because somewhere else in that same architecture, enough margin had been left, enough redundancy had been built in, enough humility had been engineered into the system to allow it to bend without breaking. This is, in the end, the only honest answer to the question this entire story was built around. The question hiding inside a title built to startle, to provoke, to promise something darker than what the facts actually deliver. Nothing sinister happened in those 12 seconds. No conspiracy, no cover-up, no secret the public was never meant to see. What happened was simply the universe, exactly as it always has, charging its standard, unforgiving price for the act of leaving the ground. A price paid this time in steel and propellant rather than in human breath. Because an entire generation of engineers made the deliberate choice to spend that price early, spend it often, spend it on empty machines over forgiving water, rather than risk spending it later on a crew with no one close enough to hear them call for help. Somewhere in the data now being studied by investigators, in the angular velocity curves, and the engine-out timestamps, and the thousands of frames of camera footage from 2 small satellites nicknamed after ballpark hot dogs, the next 12 seconds of failure are already being quietly prevented from ever happening again in quite the same way. This is what it actually looks like for a species to grow up enough to leave its home world. Not a single triumphant leap, not a flawless mission captured perfectly on film, but exactly this. Failure, examined honestly, absorbed without flinching, converted patiently into knowledge, repeated as many times as the laws of physics require, for as long as it takes. 12 seconds reminded an entire species how small it still is, standing here at the very beginning of an undertaking that may yet take centuries to complete. But 12 seconds, studied carefully enough, absorbed honestly enough, are also exactly how a species this small ever becomes anything larger than the single fragile world it was born inside of. Not despite the failures, because of how it chooses every single time to answer them.